All right. Can folks hear me? I think so. Welcome. Before I start, we want to get some logistics out of the way. Restrooms down the hall on the other side of the elevator bank. We've got gender neutral bathroom over there, and then we have another set of restrooms. My left, your right. Now, welcome everybody. My name is Livia Lamb, pronouns she, hers. I'm a program officer on the Future of Workers team here at the foundation. Future of Workers, we're focused on ensuring that all workers, including disabled people, that all workers, regardless of their employment status and occupation, have equal rights to labor protections, that social protections are guaranteed to all, and that workers shape the policies and economic systems that affect their lives. And here, this is where our work clearly intersects with our sister program, US Disability Rights. Economic justice and worker power cannot exist without disability justice. To effectively challenge inequality and advance our social justice mission, we must address the needs, concerns, priorities of the 1 billion people around the world who live with disabilities. And we're guided by the disability movement's mantra, nothing about us without us. And the foundation is working to confront ableism and expand participation and inclusion on both the institutional and individual levels. And these efforts are ongoing, and we're learning more every step of the way. This is why I feel so privileged to learn and work with my friend and colleague, Rebecca Cokley. It's through her leadership that Ford partnered with the New York Women's Foundation on this report. And that's why we're here today, for funders to learn about opportunities to build capacity in the field that support women and gender-expansive people with disabilities. I wanna thank the panel today, folks in the room and on Zoom for being here today. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm now gonna turn it over to Camille to kick us off. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome for the folks here in person, which we're so excited to finally have an in-person event for the first time, and I think since 2019. So pleasure to see you all in person, and also hello to our friends on Zoom. So again, my name is Camille Emeagwali. I'm the Senior Vice President of Programs and Strategic Learning at the New York Women's Foundation. And just to start off with a description of myself, I'm a Black woman with medium brown skin tone. I would say shoulder length curly hair with unruly grays speckled throughout it, and wearing all Black, as is the customary uniform in New York. Welcome to the launch of the New York Women's Foundation Disability Justice and Inclusion Report, called The State of Women and Girls with Disabilities in New York. As you'll all hear today, this report explores the disability justice and inclusion landscape in New York City and state with the aim of identifying the gaps in the field. Learnings from this report present an opportunity for us in the philanthropic community and beyond to help close the gap through funding and other critical support. Findings from this exploration will inform the development of a forthcoming long-term strategy for supporting people with disabilities. So today, you'll learn that only 1 penny of every $10 goes towards disability rights and social justice here in the United States. There's clearly space for us to do more, because racial justice, economic justice, and gender justice cannot exist without disability justice. At the New York Women's Foundation, we are aimed to focus on disability justice as a cross-cutting issue across our grant-making portfolio. The foundation recognizes that disability justice and inclusion are essential to all our work, from economic liberation to reproductive justice. That said, we know we have the space to grow, which is why the report is so important to us, as it identifies where there is more work to be done. For example, we want to name that we do not have an ASL interpreter here today. We reached out to several, but found out they are apparently in high demand at this time of year, so lesson learned for the New York Women's Foundation. We do know that for next time, we must seek this support earlier because it is critical to our time together. We need that expertise in the room. Our journey to deepen our work in disability justice and inclusion was kickstarted in 2019 when the New York Women's Foundation became a founding member of the President's Council on Disability and Inclusion in Philanthropy. It was a table that was convened by the presidents of the Ford Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the President's Council on Disability Inclusion it consists of 17 foundations who, like us, are committed to work towards advancing disability inclusion in our policies and practices, participation in our staff and boards, and throughout our grant making. The Council provides a space for funders to commit to continued learning in this space, as well as implementation, to advance systemic change. We all know that that's necessary within the disability inclusion space in the philanthropic sector. So together, members of the council established a Disability Inclusion Fund, which we're a part of, which is a $10 million 5-year collective investment that supports US-based organizations run by and for people with disabilities to lead transformational change. Along with other grant-making organizations, the New York Women's Foundation also signed the Disability Inclusion Pledge in 2021. And the signatures of this pledge recognize that uplifting disability in our grant-making is key, but it's also pertinent and essential to achieve social justice and equity in our work. And it calls for accountability as philanthropic organizations clearly defining their efforts in this critical area. So since then, the New York Women's Foundation has been focused on this work and furthering it in our engagement with the disability and philanthropic community. And our goal is to continue to invest in strengthening our own grant-making portfolio, and as well as increasing and strengthening networks across the disability justice community to deepen understanding of the field to inform collective action. So to do this, we are focused on grant-making in 3 key areas. One is investing in leadership of women and gender-expansive people of color with disabilities. The second is building the economic and social power of women and gender-expansive people with disabilities. And then finally, addressing the impact of the COVID pandemic on women and gender-expansive people with disabilities. So today we'd like to take the opportunity to thank our friends at the Ford Foundation, as this landscape analysis could not be done without their support. And we also want to thank Ford for hosting us today. We also want to give special thanks to Rebecca Cokley, who's been an exceptional partner for us, Livia Lamb, Casey McNaughton, and Whitney Dural for their support today. Yes, you can clap for that. We want to clap when we support our folks. So just to give you a sense of what today's program will be about, today will feature a review of the findings of the report, followed by a panel of movement leaders reacting to that report, as well as sharing how this impacts their day-to-day work supporting women and gender-expansive people with disabilities, particularly people of color. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Jessi Luckett, who is the founder and principal at Kouri Vini Consulting. Jessi is an accomplished nonprofit and philanthropic consultant for 14 plus years. She's getting shy, but it's true. And her experience has been in building and implementing programs for gender justice, racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights, and disability rights. She has extensive experience in research analysis, program design, implementation, evaluation, grant making, partnerships, and donor engagement in supporting and developing and sustaining intersectional programming. So get to know Jessi. And I want to thank you all who are in the room and on Zoom for joining us today. So without further ado, Jessi, please join us.
Hi, so as Camille just shared, I'm a little shy, but happy that you guys are here with us on Zoom and that you're also here in person. For reference, I am a Black, queer, disabled woman. I have an afro, gold glasses, and I'm wearing a very loud pink and red outfit. And so before we get started today, I just want to again say thank you to the New York Women's Foundation for trusting me to do this. I want to say thank you to the folks that I spoke to, either, transparently or either, anonymously, for sharing your lived experience in doing this work. and some of the challenges and wins that you guys have endured, that you guys have uplifted, and that really gives me the space to stand on your shoulders and uplift this work. And so, without further ado, I would love to get into some of the findings. And so Camille sort of kind of stole my opening line. Yes, for every dollar given to grant making in the United States, about 1 penny is given to disability rights work. And about a third of that penny is given to disability justice work. There is a difference when you're talking about the framework of how do you engage these communities, especially when you're talking about people of color who already have some barriers to face, on top of the intersectionality of disability. And so, where there's an opportunity in New York State to really dig into this work is really looking at, number one, who is considered disabled, who is disabled but may not know that they're disabled, and then whose voices get raised above all others. And so in New York State, there's about 3.2 million people with disabilities. And of that 3.2 million people, about 66% are people of color. Again, these are folks who know that they have a disability. There are lots of folks, especially with developmental disabilities, who do not have the consciousness to be able to frame some of their experiences within this framework. And so from there, there's a real opportunities for funders to dig deep into local and regional work. Quite a bit of funding, especially US-based funding, is on the national level. And so the disparity in infrastructure, the disparity in collaborative work that we see from local communities versus large national organizations is quite stark. This landscape, although limited in time and resources, really focused on New York State, and really focused on some of the key issue areas that came up for folks that we spoke to. There are lots of other things. Our folks who are doing work on the ground are holding many buckets, but these are the ones that they felt that were the priority. And so one of the things I want to acknowledge as we're talking about some of the findings from this report is that it is done in English. We know that there are, English as a second language folks who are also disabled. And so there's a real opportunity to expand this report later on in various languages as well as various accessible formats. And then one of the other things that we want to acknowledge is that this is not the end all be all of what's happening in the community. There are lots of areas to dip your toes into. And so I really look forward to having the opportunity to continue to explore this work. And then the last thing I want to acknowledge is that the questioning for this particular report was around the types of support that we would provide, and that being framed as, okay, general operating support, okay, sabbatical leave support, being very clear that we're talking about it from a philanthropic scope. And so without further ado, some of the areas for growth that were highlighted through this conversation are very similar to what's already happening in philanthropy, where folks on the ground are asking for the resources to network build, the resources to really think strategically about who they partner with on what projects, and being very clear on what those outcomes are. The funding landscape right now for the disability community in New York State has traditionally been secured around providing services and then also doing project-based work. And so what happened with COVID is that we saw this huge influx of government funding to start programs, to keep the lights on, to do things that, oh, that's my name tag, to do things that were not necessarily the norm when it comes to serving the disability community. And now that we've supposedly moved on from COVID, we're seeing a huge gap in funding for a lot of organizations doing critical work. And so critical work being framed as, when you don't support these things, people die. When you don't support these things, people's lives are permanently altered. And so there is an urgency there to figure out, how do we sustain these organizations and how do we get them to work together? I think one of the things that we discuss during this report is that urban-rural dynamic, where you're talking about upstate New York versus the dynamic New York City. And so are the needs the same, and where are they different? And where are we stepping in as funders and supporters and allies in this work to make sure that we're meeting both needs, even if it's a little bit outside of our funding priorities? And so from there, not just the network building, but also thinking about the revenue diversification. As I just stated, most of the resources that these organizations have been from government funding. And so I would say about 2/3 of the funding is from the government. And so when the government steps back or steps away or has another crisis or gives money to the Ukraine, then who steps up in that position? Right now, we have about, I would say, a handful of national funders who are really focusing deep on disability justice work, when we know that there are thousands, maybe even a couple of million family and public institutions that are supporting social justice work. And so how are we educating those folks about the importance of this work, as well as teaching our leaders on the field how to talk about this work with folks who don't even know what a disability is, let alone what the ADA is? And really building out models and frameworks that allow organizations and individuals receiving services from those organizations to generate revenue. What does that model look like to, I don't know, sell merchandise or fundraise or whatever resource generating opportunity that these folks want to take advantage of looks like for folks who are leading disabled organizations? And then from there, one of the things that we heard a lot about was how are we supporting legislative and policy change? A lot of folks were hesitant to step into that space because they did not know the difference between 501c3 work and 501c4 work, and wanting to be very careful that they don't lose government or individual funding for supporting specific policies and legislative work. And so really educating folks on where the line is, and also educating funders. Some of you are program officers, and we've all provided a grant that was a little bit outside of our strategic priority because the work was that important. And so where's the flexibility on the funding side to allow folks to educate constituents as well as step into this legislative / transformative work? And then last but not least, the early stage investing. Fiscal sponsors as well as philanthropic institutions in the state are investing in the 40, 60, 70-year-old organizations and not necessarily looking at the grassroots folks, the folks who were like really doing the innovative work in the field. And so how do we step away from the usual suspects? And I get it, we're all human, but the usual suspects that we fund, and really encourage those suspects to reach out to the people in the field. And so what does that type of partnership / early investment look like when we're talking about advancing this work? And for those of you who've had an opportunity to review the report, 3 of the things that we tapped into as far as issue areas are concerned was the economics of being disabled, the foster care assistance program within the state, and also reproductive health. Those are issues that have come up for both allies and people who identify as disabled. And so those are the reasons why we highlighted that. The economics being, it's been 3 years since the start of COVID. And so there is this influx of folks who are now considered disabled. And so how are we educating them on what that is and how they can be a better advocate for the movement? And then from there, I think, as most of you know, at any point in time in your life, anyone can become disabled. And so making sure that there is flexibility in this work to be inclusive, to not be gatekeepers, and also recognize the fact that there is a real disparity when it comes to earning potential. And as you know, money may not be everything, but it gives you options. And so as we were talking to some of the folks in the field, really realizing that, you know, most families are living off of, in expensive New York State, $20,000 to $23,000 a year. And so when you're living in that space of scarcity, being an ally, being an advocate of this work, having a quality of life becomes a real issue. And so being very clear that some of the policies in New York State, such as the subprime, not subprime, but sub minimum wage that allows employers to pay disabled folks below the minimum wage is an issue, especially in one of the most expensive states in the country. And so being very clear with folks who are not only unintentionally in violation of the ADA, but intentionally in violation of the ADA, that there are avenues and ways in which employees can seek support. And then as far as the foster care issue is concerned, New York State has one of the largest foster care systems in the country. And predominantly it is Latinx and Black. And so when you're talking about disability justice work within the youth system, within New York State, you're talking about people of color. You're talking about race equity. And we all know some of the issues that are faced by folks who are within the system. And so providing that additional support, especially when you're talking about the transition from being in care to becoming an adult, which usually you get, a $200 gift card and a good luck once you reach the age of 18, is really an issue in both New York and upstate. So how are we providing resources to allow folks to make that healthy transition into adulthood is one of the areas that organizations are really leaning into. And then last but not least, the issue of reproductive health, which has been a hot topic over the last couple of years. And I think part of this work is also recognizing and uplifting the need to heal from some of the transgressions that have happened from the movement, whether that is excluding people of color, excluding disabled people of color from the work, whether we're talking about eugenics or forced sterilization. We really have to recognize that there has been some missteps. And before you start asking folks to lean into the next fight for abortion access, you have to recognize where you've messed up and have those tough conversations. And so a lot of the folks that I spoke to, a lot of the case studies that I've found has really been around educating folks. Educating, letting them know that when you're talking to a disabled person and you're saying they don't have access to this medication or that medication, it is literally life-threatening. The medication that they may be taking to basically subdue some of the symptoms of their disability might actually be harmful to their pregnancy. So there's a second step or a third step that you need to take when you're engaging the disabled community in reproductive health. And then the last part of these conversations, which I found the most entertaining, is folks just being honest and transparent and saying, hey, we like sex, and doctors, healthcare providers, folks in our community are not treating us as sexual human beings. They're treating us as folks who should probably not reproduce. And so where do we change the narrative that these are individuals who want to have autonomy over their body and their lives just like everyone else? And really like leaning into those difficult conversations around what does sex look like as a woman or a non-binary person of color who also happens to be disabled. And so hopefully you guys find the report and some of the findings that we discussed today interesting, and I will be around for questions after the panel that takes place. And I am extremely proud of this report and happy to have the opportunity to speak with you guys. So.
If I may welcome our panelists. virtual panelists that we'd like to welcome to the space as well. So thank you again for joining this morning. My name is Dana Huber, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs at the New York Women's Foundation. First, I want to thank Jessi so much for everything. The report is so informative and really challenges our thinking on some of these critical issues. And so looking forward to our conversation today. I'd like to start with a visual description. I'm a white woman with blonde brown hair, and I have on a black shirt with some red pants that I assume is coordinated, so we shall see. Thank you again to everyone here in the room and also folks on Zoom today. I'd also like to just start out with some comments grounding us in the work that we've heard about to date, and then also introduce the amazing panel that you see before you. So first, we know that in the United States, 1 in 5 people is living with a disability, and resources are much needed to support the work of the leaders of this movement. Disability justice and inclusion are critical areas for philanthropic investment, particularly at the nexus of race and gender. And as we've heard today, the landscape analysis put forth a set of recommendations that explore the needs of the community and elevated opportunities for further supporting this work throughout the state. And so now that we've heard these recommendations, we'd love to hear reactions from movement leaders in the disability justice and inclusion field. And these esteemed panelists work on this issue through a multitude of areas, from philanthropy to mental health support to advocacy for those living with long COVID and associated conditions, as well as legal support for those living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I'd like to briefly introduce these movement leaders, share excerpts of their impressive bios, and please ask them to further uplift their experience during our conversation. So first, I'd like to welcome Rebecca Cokley, the Program Officer of the U.S. Disability Rights Program at the Ford Foundation. Her work is focused on strengthening the field, building a pipeline of diverse leadership, promoting disability pride, and mobilizing resources toward disability rights work. She serves as the Foundation's liaison to the President's Council for Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy. Next, I'd like to welcome JD Davids, the co-founder and chief strategic officer of Strategies for High Impact and Long COVID Justice. He's a health justice strategist for networks of disabled and chronically ill people, a queer and trans person living with ME/CFS, long COVID, and other complex chronic conditions. He writes and hosts conversations for the Cranky Queer Guide to Chronic Illness and is a member of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. Prianka Nair is Assistant Professor of Clinical Law and Faculty Director of the Disability and Civil Rights Clinic at the Brooklyn Law School. The clinic represents adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities with respect to a range of issues, including access to public benefits, housing and guardianship termination, and restoration of rights. And on the virtual panel with us today is Kelly George. She joined the Fireweed Collective in 2022 after decolonization of Fireweed Collective, formerly the Icarus Project. Fireweed is now a completely BIPOC-led team that consists of community organizers, zine artists, facilitators, cultural workers, and education leaders that work at the intersection of disability justice and healing justice. Kelly now serves as the Programs and Partnerships Lead with the Fireweed Collective, and as a collective member, Kelly oversees program operations, grants, and nourishes movement relationships. So thank you for letting me introduce you. You are all amazing humans, and so if I may, start by asking each of the panelists, what were your reactions from the landscape analysis and what stood out for you? And Rebecca, can we start with you?
Definitely. Hi, I'm Rebecca Cokley. As said, I'm the U.S. Disability Rights Program Officer here at Ford. The first thing I want to do, because I always do this, is I want to welcome the disabled people in the room and the disabled people that have joined us virtually. We are happy that you're here. Whether or not it is safe for you to self-identify publicly or professionally, it matters. And our community is infinitely strengthened by your presence. I am a little person. I have achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. I have now chin length. It was shoulder length last week. Red hair, a glorious abundance of freckles, and I am wearing a really funky colored dress that I have yet to figure out how to describe, but it's got more pink than I am typically comfortable with. You know, I think what really struck me in the report was just sort of just like we know what the disparities are. We've known them for years. The idea that 1 cent of every $10 goes towards the disability community, that is just rattling. If you're not shook by that, then there's a problem. Looking at the disparities specifically in the Bronx and the Bronx compared to the other 5 boroughs, gotta have love for the BX. And also if we are seriously committed to centering those in the most need, that's where the most need very clearly is in the city. And also obviously the conversation around urban versus rural. We know that across the country, over 1/3 of people with disabilities live in rural communities. And when you think about what that means, when you talk to disabled folks in rural America, their responses were stuck. Like, we can't leave. We know things would be better elsewhere, but when you can't leave, what alternatives are there? And so I think it continues for us to highlight things that we know, but also to specifically be able to zero in. And that to me is very important at the Ford Foundation. You're all here today in this gloriously lovely building and with our inaccessible garden. And our amazing, phenomenal gallery on the first floor, which I strongly suggest folks check out. And at the same time, people in this very same community are really struggling. And I think it's really easy for those of us in philanthropy to feel like the issue is like an issue out there, to even within our own spaces, otherize these communities and these issues. And that's something that we simply can't be doing.
Thank you. JD, I'd like to ask you the same question. What really stood out for you in the report, and what would you like to say about the findings?
Sure. I want to start out also echoing Rebecca's thanks to disabled and chronically ill people who are with us today in whatever form. And I also want to thank those who are not with us today because you are resting and taking care of yourself, because that is the work that we do. First to stand out was the report explicitly asked about long COVID. Thank you. That means a lot. And what we've seen is it's hard enough for people to have any sort of information, diagnosis, recognition, or respect for long COVID. It's really important to ask. And I can speak more later about what else we can ask about that also means that people don't have to self-identify as long COVID. That really speaks to accessing the human rights to health. I also appreciate with such a monumental task of so much to cover that, oh, I'm sorry, I'd like to back up and do a visual description of myself. I'm a light-skinned white person with trans-masculine appearance with a lesbian-inspired mullet, brown hair. I'm wearing a stylish P100 respirator, which has gone through a DIY fit test, which you can learn to do online, which provides pretty much 100% protection from airborne pathogens, even in a well-ventilated, unusually well-ventilated room like this. I'm wearing a dark gray blazer with a linen, I think, shirt under it with sherbet-colored stripes of blue, dark blue, gold, and orange, and rust-colored pants and black work boots. Anyway, with such a monumental task, I appreciated the strategy of having these standout issues, such as reproductive health, including sex, such as economics, that were done even within each section in an intersectional way, thus demonstrating how many more topics there are yet to cover in that way. And also the explicit, so to speak, referencing of sex, sexual desire, sexual practices in the document. And the findings and recommendations, which I will briefly say, to expand the ecosystem, to diversify revenue, to have foster collaboration on policy and legislation, and to support early stage organizations with general operating support. Strategies for High Impact was founded in January of 2022. So we're experiencing the need for all of these things. Particularly, there is not an ecosystem around long COVID. It's a mass disabling event that's affected well over 100 million people in the world, and there's no ecosystem. So I can speak a little bit later, hopefully, about what's on the sort of shoulders and consciousness of underfunded, unfunded advocacy groups.
And Prianka, if we can hear from you next, what stood out for you from the report, and what would you like to share?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me here and for giving me the opportunity to review and share my thoughts about this report. It's an extraordinary achievement.
I will just start with a description of myself. I am a South Asian woman. I'm wearing all black, as Camille said, in the fashion of New Yorkers. I have an accent that's not New York based, but in every other way I have assimilated. So I'm wearing a black top, a black blazer, black pants, and black shoes, and glasses, and a very cool medical mask here. In terms of this report, the things that really stood out to me was the recognition that intersectionality has become a bit of a buzzword, right? And that's what this, and so has disability justice, quite frankly. And I quote Leroy Moore when, from who really is self-advocate and extraordinary writer about disability issues, who has expressed frustration with the fact that disability justice is not reaching the communities that it was meant to serve, but certainly has a role in scholarship, including my scholarship. So I recognize the irony of that. It's spoken about in these rarefied spaces. And what I loved about the report was the fact that it really centers how to shift power, how to bring it back into communities. And no, that's why it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary feat. How to shift power back into the communities, and it puts it in very clear terms. So disability justice, the disability justice principles are broad principles, they're conceptual ideas, and to think about how to translate them into practice, that's what this report does. Where should you build capacity? How do you transfer power? What does that look like, and which are the areas that need to be addressed? And how do you really amplify the voices of the people who are most impacted by discriminatory policies? So yeah, that's my reaction to this. And yeah.
Thank you. And Kelly, as we welcome you into the space virtually, we'd love to hear what your reactions were to the report and what stood out for you.
Hi there all, Kelly George here. I am a Black Latinx, queer, neurodivergent, bipolar woman, and I am currently on Lenape land in Brooklyn, New York. Brief image description, I mentioned a Black Latinx person, shaved hair, and an orange blazer this morning. And I have chosen to communicate from the safety of my home in solidarity and cross solidarity with the disability justice movement. So I appreciate and thank the Ford Foundation and the New York Women's Foundation and all who are here that made that accessible to me. And I'd also like to echo what my colleagues and comrades in the movement have already cited, that folks who are experiencing the depths of disability and neurodivergent MAD experiences are in my view are people that survive, and that takes so much more than I think is acknowledged often. And so I just needed to mention that. And so all those who are present and all those who are not with us, as JD mentioned, I am just holding space for you. And with regards to my reaction on the report, as many have said, it is a great feat to try and quantify and understand the depths of a movement, such as the disability justice movement, as well as the intersections, right, with racial, economic, and particularly in my organization, I am focused on healing justice as well. And what healing justice adds to the lens of disability justice is that healing looks different for everyone. Our motto is fight to heal and heal to fight. And so that is a really important principle that also intersects this work And again, the naming of the 66% of the disability community here in New York are BIPOC folks. That was something that really stood out to me, mainly because I am a part of that community, and mainly also because it's so hard to fathom that disability justice and healing justice just came on the map, right? It just became valid of eyes, of media, which was not as present before. And so there's just such a long lineage, right, that goes back with healing justice and where it started. You know, we may debate about such, but in my knowledge bank, it started with marginalized communities. And so again, I'm thinking of all of these things as I read the report. And again, I also want to appreciate that there was mention of the limitations, right? And the limitations of our reviews as individuals and as researchers. So yeah, those are a couple things that stood out for me.
Thank you, Kelly. That's a perfect segue into the question that I want to ask our panel is what was missing in all of the work that you do? What is something that we need to uplift in this space that wasn't necessarily covered in the report? And Rebecca, if we might start with you.
I thought of two things. You know, the first, I think we need to have a conversation with the women's community. We need to have a very serious conversation with the women's community. The fact that every year we continue to see Equal Pay Day highlighted and Equal Pay Day across multiple communities. But until last year in the work of the Disability Economic Justice Collaborative, we never saw anyone address the fact that when is Equal Pay Day for women and gender expansive people with disabilities? And what does it mean that for decades of this being like a day of reckoning that disabled women were not at the table and were intentionally excluded because it meant that the women's leadership organizations would have to acknowledge that they have sat by and done nothing while the subminimum wage has existed, while the Small Business Administration can deny loans to people with disabilities because we're not considered a marginalized community, while all of these systems have existed and we haven't been at the table. And so I really want to also take a moment to commend the New York Women's Foundation because this is a big deal. The recognition of the issues facing disabled women and girls in New York, and the fact that it's the New York Women's Foundation that did this work, not a disability rights or justice centered organization, but one that is working to live those values and do that work, is massive. And not only should women's groups pay attention, but also disability groups should pay attention, because the lack of work in the disability community around race and around gender expansive people is unacceptable. Those are your people, and across the board, they have been failed by the systems that were set up to support them. You know, and the other piece that I think is sort of a scaling up of or a scaling down of what we're seeing nationally right now is the fight around home care. And you know, what we're seeing in New York mirrors what we're seeing federally. Around, you know, we've had 3 different federal attempts to get funding for home care. We are actively watching the unwinding of Medicaid in this moment. There are over 800,000 people in this country who are on waiting lists to live in the community and not die in nursing homes. And do you know where the pandemic started? Nursing homes, because of nursing home deregulation. Raise your hand if you're interested in going into a nursing home in your lifetime. Okay, we got one. Your mom's a hookup, good to know. You know, on the whole, what we're seeing is these are not safe spaces. And, you know, until disabled people can actually drive the decision-making about where they live, who they love, if they can love, if they can get married, if they can have children in 20 states where you can lose custody of your kid just for being disabled. You know, all of this comes down to the care conversation. And I think that, and what we're seeing in New York is endemic of what we're seeing nationally at this point in time.
Thank you. I wanted to preface this by saying after I speak, I will be going to the bathroom, so I'm sorry I will be missing comments from some comrades, but that's one of my access needs. Very much implied and sort of pushing towards in this report, but not said perhaps as explicitly as it can or will be as we discuss it, is moving from inclusion to justice to liberation. As I was taught by my mentors in ACT UP, including Kiyoshi Kuramiya, Mary Lucy, and Nancy McNeil, liberation means that those of us who are who we are and live how we live don't need to be equal with others. We actually have important lessons of ways of being that will improve society and the world for everyone. And so, for example, when we look at, to the extent there has been some coverage about long COVID, it has focused on economics and loss of people in the workforce. I think what's important to recognize also is that when it comes to energetic disabilities, for example, probably 50% or more of people with long COVID qualify for a diagnosis of myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, which is an extremely debilitating disease that limits functioning energetically profoundly. While it's extremely important, as is mentioned in the report, that we have accommodations for people to be able to work with long COVID, the truth is, for many, if not the majority of people with long COVID, our work is to rest. Rest is a medical term. Rest is a clinical practice. It's not relaxation. It's difficult. And it's something that needs to be practiced by not working and by having help in our homes and by having help caring with our children and our elders. And that help could be provided by other disabled and chronically ill people who are trained and supported to do this work for one another. And look at the models that have already come of CRIP doulas, as the term was coined by Stacey Park Milburn. CRIP doulas who help each other, right? And so what can we do to not just make care available, but make care available by and for us? And to recognize that the specific barriers even to the disability benefits that are sought for and needed by people with long COVID mentioned in the report, there's extra barriers to so-called invisible disabilities, things that are intermittent, things that have absolutely tests and signs of, but that aren't accepted by, regular common Quest Labs medicine. There's sort of some specificities that in the short report would be hard to get to. And lastly, I would say the title for this event was more gender inclusive. The report is labeled for women and girls, and there are much of it is, of course, broadly and specifically applicable not just to trans women, but trans people overall. I think there's an opportunity to go through of each section and say, are there some specificities here, particularly for trans women and femmes who are Black and brown, who have specific relationships to reproduction, sex, the legal system, the work system, that can be uplifted in this report. It's almost there. It's all but there. So thank you for that.
So it is difficult to be the one who always goes last. So I don't know if Kelly wants to say something first so that we don't preempt everything that she might want to say. Or they might want to say. I don't know. Well, okay, I'll go ahead. There are two main things. Oh, hi. Do you want to say something? You can go ahead.
Hi, I could. I appreciate you. Sure. So with regards to what's missing, so I think my mind automatically, as I mentioned previously, was thinking about healing justice and that lineage. And just to name where it started, Kara Page is one of the premier idea founders in Kindred. And even Kara Page and Erica Woodland have recently published a book called Healing Justice Lineages, which really gives an overview of where the movement started for Black, queer, and trans neurodivergent folks. And I think Mariam Kaba has also written so beautifully about what the movement looks like and our place in it. So just naming that, but so the missing piece of healing justice and really how our medical industrial complex serves or disserves the people that we are looking to help. And so I think Jessi beautifully sort of mentioned this at the beginning, but really, I mean, the access to healthcare in the state that it is really creates a huge barrier for the folks that need it most. And if from a Fireweed collective perspective, and I can also say these are my own thoughts, but a mix. That abolishing the medical industrial complex feels like something I'd want to see. What does it look like, and how do we continue to care for the folks, and what does the alternative look like? I don't have all of those answers, but because it is in such disarray, and the histories of underserving Black, queer, trans, neurodivergent folks is so prevalent, that disability doulas are necessary, right? So when we go and attend, or excuse me, when we're looking for care and we need advocacy to go with us, or someone to support the making sure that we receive the care that is necessary. And I'm sorry, I see a sign out hanging on the screen, but I can't find it. Thank you. I don't know, it disappeared. Yes, so just considering that, and again, recognizing some of the things that were mentioned about folks who are in rural areas, and really acknowledging how do we get care to the folks who are most in need, with the least amount of harm.
Thank you. So I have three main ideas, and I really do feel like the report is building to these points, but I just wanted to perhaps suggest some framing. And all of these issues of sexual autonomy, the child regulation or the family regulation system, the foster care system, the economic injustice, all of that is really also, and Kelly just mentioned the medical industrial complex. I want to kind of draw attention to its corollary, the prison industrial complex. All of these are about systems of incarceration. And while we are in the community, the fact is that carceral logic, or the logic of those spaces, of those institutions, of those prisons, can permeate the way that we think about reform. And that's incredibly, and each of these issues of sexual autonomy, guardianship, these are coercive systems. To live in a group home is to be subject to rules about who you can interact with and how you interact with them, and whether you have sex. They're not spaces that support disabled families. And that is a result of regulating bodies. And I would say that's an example of carceral logic. So I feel like really highlighting that, that is something that we should be thinking about when we think about what to support within communities, is maybe the dismantling of that. The other piece that is very related is the long reach, and again, kind of the theme that I see through all of these three areas that have been highlighted in this report, is the idea of the long reach of the state into the lives of people, and just how that creates systems of surveillance that mean that people with disabilities really have to constantly account for themselves. And what happens with people with intellectual and developmental disability and surveillance, and certainly, the demographic I serve, people with intellectual and developmental disability, is the idea that surveillance is somehow beneficial for them, or at worst, innocuous. without recognizing how profoundly it affects people. So, you know, Rebecca, you mentioned home care, and electronic visit verification has been a system that has been rolled out, right? And it is deeply disturbing that one would keep such close tabs on how care is provided in the home, how intimate care is provided in the home. And I think that's a form of surveillance that kind of criminalizes or penalizes disability. So that's something else that that emphasis on, you know, state surveillance, I think, is something that's happening, and automated decision making as well. And finally, in terms of a focus, you know, again, to take, Kelly mentioned Mariam Kaba, Angela Davis, these are all bringing that abolitionist framework to the report, and thinking about organizations that don't just want to reform the system, but want to rethink the system, because that's what disability justice is really about. You know, it's about reimagining what this whole system would look like if it was broken down and rebuilt by those most impacted. And it was built on systems of interdependence rather than independence, which, so the emphasis is not about being a productive member of society, but being valued for who you are within that society. So those were some framing that I kind of thought was important to highlight in this report, and kind of connects it to a larger discourse about disability justice.
Thank you so much. One of the goals of the report was really to help inform our, as the New York Women's Foundation's disability justice and inclusion strategy for grant making. And we're really thrilled that we have this reference now to do so. But I wanted to ask the panel, how can philanthropy better support disability justice and inclusion efforts? And what are ways that philanthropy can uplift leaders in this critical space? And if I may start with Kelly.
Thank you so much. I think a couple things came to mind, and I, you know, echoing my colleagues, just holding the irony, right, of ableism and a society that sort of prioritizes ableism in ways that are don't serve, and anti-ableism, right? Abolition, and we do have a carceral models, and then capitalism and anti-capitalism. We live in a capitalist society, so we have to hold that. And so just holding those complexities, I think, as you know, the report has also done in many ways, is going to be important. And so yes, thank you to the New York Women's Foundation for really lifting this and beginning to highlight how important it is to hold all the complexities of this movement. And I think another piece that's also been mentioned, and just I think starting with the framework and is really important. You know, how does the state play into policy and individual lives, right? The long reach of the state, as my colleague and comrade has said, is a problem. It's a problem. I want to say challenge to make it sound nice, but it's a problem. And solutioning that problem starts with acknowledging that problem. You know, we can do news reporting on, you know, how BIPOC, queer, neurodivergent, trans folks, gender nonconforming folks are still seen in many communities as a threat, are still surveilled in different ways, and in, you know, certain, even in New York. I was raised in New York, so yes, I understand that I can walk from, I'll speak to Brooklyn, I can walk from Prospect Heights to Crown Heights and notice differences. And I can walk to just different communities and see stark differences of what is accessible and what folks are able to access. And so I think thinking about all of those pieces are going to be very, very paramount for funders and folks who are looking to support this work. And in addition, it was mentioned at the top, nothing without us, nothing for us, about us without us. And so for me, some really great models that I can speak to are organizations that are considering participatory grant making. And so I had the great honor of participating on a pilot, the first Borealis philanthropy, Black-led fund by Borealis Philanthropy. And really, there was so much intentionality in choosing and giving folks that shift of power by going to the communities and getting their input on how to approach this work and giving them the final say of how and who is going to get funding. That is power that I couldn't even understand, for one, but the shift and the privilege to be able to be so close to that conversation is monumental. And so I would just encourage funders and others to consider participatory grant making as an option. And yeah, that's what I have for now. Thank you.
Great. I'll open it up to the panelists. How can philanthropy better support disability justice and inclusion efforts?
I can jump in. Something our CEO talks a lot about is embracing risk and reflecting harm, or sorry, reflecting honesty. And we sit in a building right now that was funded and created by a eugenicist. Every day I come into work, I know that Henry Ford is rolling over in his grave because people like me exist, and because people like me work here, and because people like me make decisions about where to move money. And eugenics hasn't stopped. In 2013, when I had my daughter, I was laying on the table in the operating room after having a really arduous C-section. And the anesthesiologist said to my OBGYN, well, while you're down there, why don't you go ahead and tie her tubes? People they don't need to have more kids. And, at the time I had just finished serving as a staff person in the Obama White House. I was running a federal agency, and you don't expect to have to defend your life choices while naked on a long metal table in an operating room. And yet there I was. And, that's the reality for so many millions of disabled people. And I think as you brought up so rightly, like the conversation around the policing of bodies and the role of the state, and it is state violence, let's be really clear. And state violence looks like a lot of different things. And so I think really starting off, like, philanthropy needs to look at itself and say, what harm have you done? And how do we move forward? And how do we move forward not centering ourselves as philanthropy, but centering the communities that we've harmed? The second piece is stop grant making with an ableist gaze. It's exhausting, you're lazy, you're doing it wrong, and you will continue to fail to achieve the outcomes you want as long as people with disabilities and chronic illnesses are not included in your work. You will never end poverty as long as disabled people are not at the table. You will never end mass incarceration as long as disabled people are not at the table. So why are you continuing to put money into a system through structures that are intended to fail from day one? The third piece, I think, is acknowledging the long reach of the state as it relates to government money. Before philanthropy, quote unquote, Columbused disability or discovered it a few years ago, the only entities funding disability work was the federal government. Who puts the rules in place that says disabled people can't have more than $2,000 in a bank account? The same government. Who prohibits people with disabilities from being able to work and maintain healthcare at the same point in time? The federal government. And so what we have seen as a result of government investment in disability, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying they should stop. I'm saying they need to reframe their thinking, and it provides an opportunity for philanthropy. But what it leads to, though, is many of the fights that exist today within the disability community. They used funding to divide and conquer a movement, whether it be solely funding blindness and deafness in the early days, to taking money from those communities and giving it to Down syndrome, making Down syndrome the disability flavor of the month. How do you think that makes the blind and deaf community feel about the Down syndrome community? And then taking the Down syndrome money in the 80s and giving it to making autism the monster under the bed in the 90s, and completely now neglecting long COVID. You know, and so what has it done? It has defunded the building of a movement. It has actually put in place rigid walls and silos across groups. You know, I remember in the W administration when we weren't allowed to talk about the fact that 60 to 80% of women with intellectual disabilities are raped or assaulted by the age of 18. Don't talk about girls with Down syndrome getting raped, but encourage them to make good friends. You know, and these are policy decisions that have lifelong impacts for the people that we serve. And so thinking about, in that space, how can philanthropy be a space for innovation? What is your role in doing things differently? What are the places and the unique spaces where there never has been funding? Because there's a lot of it in the disability space. And what can you do to fill that up? And the last piece, and I'm gonna be really serious, is, and I've been serious throughout, but like, the anti-trans legislation is ableist as hell. It's wrong in general, and it specifically calls out mental illness and autism when we know that those communities are disproportionately likely to identify as trans. And so so pushing back on that legislation is equally important for disability funders.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for all this. I would add a few things and emphasize or re-emphasize. We need philanthropy to hammer home that pandemics are chronic. We are simply shocked that something like long COVID happened, shows the depth of misunderstanding and willful ignorance, right? We knew this was going to happen. People with ME had it happen to us, you know? We called it. I helped pull together a webinar on March 7th of 2020 of chronically ill people saying, what is this thing that's happening and what do we need and what can we do about it? So what do you do if pandemics are chronic? Well, one is pandemics come in all different forms. You center disabled and chronically ill people in any planning and implementation and funding for any emergent or ongoing events. It should be on every single checklist of every single topic across issues and dockets. Also, philanthropy can use your funding for technical assistance, capacity building, professional development to sustain and please improve remote and hybrid access. It's gone away. What are you doing about it? People I love and you love, or don't know you love yet, but you would, are basically locked in at home for the foreseeable future, not even able to go to get necessary medical care without risking perhaps irreversible harm or death. You know, there's a smattering of stories of, you know, young people who were running marathons, now they have long COVID, they can't get out of bed. That's true. But many, if not the majority of people with long COVID were already disabled and chronically ill. And getting COVID again and again and again can mean a difference between being able to live at home and losing our home, being able to parent or losing our children. So the stakes are very high on whether we are able to maintain social connections and ties and resist isolation through this kind of programming. It's not a nice to have, it's life and death for people. And by not going to conferences that lack remote access or pretend that a live stream is hybridity, I'm sorry, but that's being complicit. And we need to rethink the conference industrial complex that funding structures have almost forced some nonprofits to use as a money-making venture, so they can't afford to not have that conference. There are much better uses for that money, and there's different ways of doing things, and there's safer ways of doing things. and funding to put, the kind of ventilation they have here everywhere that organizations are meeting and having the basics. The second is to recognize what we're under now. Speaking of that, those of us who are doing this work, at a certain point in being an HIV advocate, which I've been for 100 years, there was a system, there's ecosystem, there's programs. So we said, shame, wrong, do more of that and less of this. With no ecosystem and no real even information, what disabled and chronically ill people are being forced to do is the basics of what masks work. Why should you wear a mask? Why does it not matter if it's your grandma on the bus, someone's grandma's on the bus, you should be wearing them? Why do we have to do these basics of the information and how do you access these things? So we have to do the information level. We then have to do the context level, the explanation. Well, if you're going indoors, here's what a CO2 monitor is, or here's why you should be able to have it outside, or we have to explain the context. And then lastly, we do the part we should only have to do, which is the campaigning, which is going as millions missing to lay down in front of the White House as people with ME to say, I should be resting, but I have to protest. Or the Carry Majority campaign here in New York, insisting that we are going to expose the complicity of wrecking people who are doing home care and the people who rely on them again through these backroom deals. So there's a lot to do. So let us get funding for that, please. Like, there's so much we're doing that should be the state's role, right? But if we don't do it, our people will die. And then last, as we move to the end of the public health emergency, if we're ending this federal public health emergency, we should be moving to the ongoing stage of recovery and resilience. But we're not. Just things are going away. And so it's really important for foundations and philanthropy to understand the implications and have a plan, and to work with community to understand what we can do. The CDC has an action plan. It's like a PDF for people who are immune suppressed that they put out when the prophylactic infusion that could prevent COVID stopped working because of resistance, because of uncontrolled spread. And it was basically like, put this on your refrigerator so you have the doctor's number to call. There was nothing there for us. There's no plan for our people. We need help. Last, recognize this is the real opportunity, right? This is the moment as more and more people have to sadly come to consciousness about what isn't here for disabled and chronically ill people as they and their loved ones have long COVID. It's an opportunity for political education and mobilization to change everything, which is basically what we have to do. We need to recognize we could have single-payer healthcare today and still not have care for people with long COVID, ME, and other complex chronic conditions. Nowhere in the world is doing what needs to be done. Sometimes even particularly places with socialized medicine. Our people are dying. So we ask philanthropy to come together and use your leverage with public payers, use your leverage with private donors, use your leverage to bring us in to make and fund the plans to change everything, because even though things are very bad right now, this is the opportunity to do so.
Okay, so I have, I feel like people have spoken so eloquently about this that I have one brief point to make. When I think about ableism, I think we tend to think that it's a disability issue, but one can face ableism without having a disability, right? Ableism really is about bodies, and it's about not appreciating difference as merely difference, but actually assigning a negative value to those different bodies. So it intersects with race in that way, because it is about assigning a value to certain racialized bodies. And it intersects with, sex, and it intersects with all of, and gender identity. It just intersects with all of these things. And so there is a tendency to think that we need to be funding organizations that are disability specific or have a disability mission. I say this as someone who runs a disability specific clinic and benefits from that and is grant funded. But when we're talking about broad concepts, like the problems that come from automated decision making, the problems that come from surveillance and kind of police surveillance, to talk about surveillance in its kind of traditional format. If we are going to be talking about environmental justice, all of them are to do with ableism. All of them are to do with disability. And so I don't think we should just be looking for entities that have disability as a specific focus. I think that all of these movements have a disability focus. And I think that that's where philanthropy can really change the language around disability, can really drive the movement towards seeing that, environmental justice, campaigning against climate change really is about also forces that might disable bodies. And I just want to be very careful. Disability is not the end product of a poor system, right? And I don't want to deprive it of its value and its culture and disability culture either. But I just think that that is something that we should be thinking about. Maybe looking at funding things that are not traditional, funding things that have to do with electronic or digital discrimination, for instance, that have a real implication for disability. So not siloing disability as its own specific thing, but really recognizing that it is central to all of these movements and implicated in them.
Thank you so much to the panel. I'd like to shift over now to questions and answers from our audience, both online and in the space here. And if I may ask our colleagues that will be sharing microphones with folks to get those over on the side. If you have a question in the room, signal to our microphone leads that you have one. And then also our colleague who's running the Zoom can read out some of those questions as well from folks online. So please think about all the things you want to ask our panel. But yes. If you'd like, yeah.
Thanks. Hi, y'all. My name's Erin. I am who knows what young means, but a young white woman. Well, I'm with brunette hair and a blue shirt and black jeans and Converse and a neck scarf. And I have a question about exactly what Prianka was talking. There that goes. Exactly what Prianka was talking about the fact that this question that we're discussing of disability and healing justice it touches all of these other things that have, for better and worse, been separated from one another. And I'm part of an organization that funds individuals specifically. And one of the difficulties I've found with that and thinking about that is that uplifting one individual often creates real harm because it creates a scarcity mindset for people. And on the one hand, I understand why this particular organization feels really strongly about funding individuals. It's very hard to fund individuals, and so there's definitely a place for doing that. However, I could never have all the context required to know like which individual should be the person uplifted at any given time, and there's always a good reason that it could be any number of people. And so bearing that in mind, I would love to hear what you think about what it would look like to actually really collectivize this movement, which is to say, to recognize that this is deeply entwined with like all of the things that you're discussing. Like, I don't know if reproductive justice was mentioned specifically, but like we all touched on that. We know what's in the room. What would it look like to actually discuss all these concerns as the same movement? And who or what should be the voice of that movement? Like, is it a person who actually embodies as many of those identities as possible? I assume it's probably not, because that's a lot of work. But I would be curious to hear what you think about actually recognizing this all as one issue and moving it as such.
I can venture a response. I'm a lawyer, and there is a tendency amongst lawyers to think that you're the center of a disability justice movement or disability rights. It's all me. Right, it was a shock to me too. No, but it's been a real problem with lawyering. The belief that the only way to achieve change is through litigation, through the court system, and that's that's the difference between the disability rights framework and the disability justice one. One is very inaccessible. But what I have been seeing is a move towards movement lawyering and community lawyering. which really involves a subordination of the lawyer's ego, which is very difficult, but really involves actually looking at ways in which you can support community voices. And I really have to emphasize here something that I think is critical to this mission, which is power shifting. So I see no problem with, or I see lots of complexity with supporting individuals and figuring out which individuals. I will not say community engagement is easy. You need to find the point. What is a community, right? Who is in a community? Who is leadership of a community? It's not like these are very easily identified entities. And there will be mistakes made along the way with individuals who, whether you've actually properly engaged with the community or not. That does not mean you don't engage in that effort of trying to find out who the leadership is, what the points of tension are within the community, what you can address. And then actually, create it. The one way of doing movement lawyering is to clear the way for organizers to do their work. So that means, addressing the legality of picketing, for instance, and kind of clearing the way so that people can do that protest work. Or it might involve actually taking yourself out of the picture altogether. So creating systems where you don't necessarily center representation as something that you need to do in order to get a just result. So not saying, you should be entitled to legal counsel when you come into this negotiation process, because that does put law and the lawyer at front and center, but really kind of saying we need to design a process where people can engage without the need of that expertise in the middle, So to answer your question, I don't know, I'm grappling with it. I'm really grappling with it. But I think mistakes are a part of this process. Engaging with some individuals at the expense of others is something that's going to happen. But at the same time, this is an opportunity to have a meaningful dialogue with the community that the individuals are from and seek to represent, and really interrogating those relationships. So yeah, I think it's painful but necessary work.
I would just say I think it requires us to be stretchy. Like stretchy like 80s spandex. I not like Spanx. I find myself in when I do my grant making, having a lot of conversations with a wide variety of people that might not see themselves as being a traditional stronghold of disability rights work or disability justice work. And yet I know that what they're doing is like disability rights or disability justice. I know that they're doing gender justice. And I think, as funders, we've perpetuated the siloing by saying we fund X, Y, and Z. And for example, right now at Ford, we're having a whole conversation around gender equity work. And, I sat there and did a deep dive into my grant making because I was like, I want to see where we line up in this. If it do I build something separate or not? And being able to sit there and ascertain that, over a third of our grant making is going to BIPOC and women majority organizations. And within that, 85% of that grant making is going to BIPOC women-led organizations or projects. And people are like, well, how did you get there? And it's like, because when I had conversations with people that may not have seen themselves doing this work specifically, but I know they were, whether they were doing work around mass incarceration, whether they were doing economic justice work, saying, so what does the disability lens look like on your work? Who are the disabled people that you serve? What does that engagement look like? Who are your partners in that space? And really expanding our mindset as to what the work should look like into what the work could look like. And encouraging people to take risks and to mess up, and to have people around. So when somebody messes up and they're like, I totally screwed up, I asked something that was inappropriate, or we held an event in an inaccessible location, or any number of things, it's like, that's part of the learning. And here's some people that you can engage. We're not cutting you off. We're not sticking you on timeout or the bad kids corner. what does it look like to give you the tools and resources that you need for the work to succeed and thrive?
Thank you. I do want to be mindful of time and note that we've gone a minute over, but want to thank everyone for joining us here in the audience. Oh, we have a question online, please.
Can you hear me? So we have a question from someone. This is Cecilia Cortez from the New York Women's Foundation speaking. We have a question from someone in Zoom, did not identify themselves. It said, a question for everyone. The interviewees for this report listed on the next to last page were mostly foundation staff and staff at independent living centers. What do you think was lost by leaving grassroots disability justice movement leaders?
Hi, thank you for highlighting that. Again, my name is Jessi. I'm a Black queer disabled woman with an afro, wearing gold glasses, and a very loud red and pink shirt. I think this falls into the category of limitations. A lot of folks that we did reach out to who were doing the roots work just did not have the capacity to participate. They did not have the moment to stop and rest and to reflect and to really give thoughtful and sustainable feedback within the time frame that we had to do the research and to do the work. And so that is one of the things that we hope to continue to do in the future. And I just want to pose this comment to the panel and thank them so much for taking the time to provide the feedback, to read the report. A lot of what I heard was, hey, it would have been great if we can just do more and expand more. And some of you are funders, so I just want to point that out. Like, talk to me after the event. And yeah, and again, really use it as an opportunity to do the mapping. I think what's needed right now is grassroots mapping in the States, and that is a very different feat, and it will take a very different amount of resources to do.
Yeah, I think I'd also add to that from the New York Women's Foundation, please reach out to us. We'd love to meet people and be in dialogue. So our emails are on the website, so please do reach out to us. Thank you. And another question from the online panel.
There's another question again, Cecilia Cortez from the New York Women's Foundation speaking. Amy Lippincott says, sorry for not finishing reading the report, but to what extent are many of these issues driven by the extreme underrepresentation of people with disabilities as employees in the social sector, philanthropy, and nonprofits?
I would pause and say we also need to think about the fact that there are disabled people in a lot of organizations, but organizational culture does not make it safe for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses to self-identify. And, so I think, yes, there is employment discrimination. Yes, codified ableism in the workplace is a real thing. But one of the things that I have learned in my experience in every job that I have ever been in, whether it be selling bras for Victoria's Secret to walking the halls of the Ford Foundation, is that within 6 months at any job, people start sending me the, hey, can we have a cup of coffee conversation? And I'm like, okay, either you're quitting or you're telling me you're disabled. And 9 times out of 10, it's they're telling me they're disabled. And, how do you navigate the space? And so I think there's also, while we definitely need to see greater representation of people with disabilities inside the social justice sector, we need to actually transform the social justice sector so it is a safe place for people with disabilities from the mailroom to the boardroom to be able to self-identify and trust that A, they will be supported, and B, they will get the accommodations that they have civil rights entitlement to in order to succeed and thrive.
If I could just quickly share experiences, recognizing that this happens even in institutions and sectors dedicated to health and disability issues. So many of my loved ones and comrades are in the HIV sector, and they think they have long COVID, and they're not telling each other, and it's hard, it's re-traumatizing because there's such the rhetoric, the stigmatizing rhetoric, that now we have treatment and everyone's going to be healthy and fine. So actually to be disabled and living with HIV, there's incredible stigma. And that's why we want to work at those intersections. We know that people with HIV and people with diabetes are 4 times as likely to have long COVID. Yet there's stigma in both those communities about being sick, about being disabled. So we got to start there, even to make it safe for people to even acknowledge what's going on in their own bodies and to have that feeling that it's not going to be, well, it is going to be harmful. They do stand to risk and lose things. But are we there for them? Are they there for each other?
Thank you, JD, for naming that. I'll just say really quickly, this is Kelly George speaking. I think, as I think of my own experience in the workplace, I have what could be under the umbrella of an invisible disability. As a bipolar neurodivergent, I was petrified to share any piece of that information for the reason of stigma. Will I be considered unreliable? Can I even share the limitations and access needs that I deserve to be a full person in the workplace? And honestly, the list could go on for a little bit. How are my colleagues going to view me? Is there going to be any protection or how do I even discern microaggressions? Who do I tell? If I tell someone, is there recourse? Like these discussions need to continue to happen in all of the places. And as a person who's in the grassroots movement, I feel like, we look at each other as like the lived experience is the thing that we carry and embody everywhere we go, everywhere we move. And we look at each other and we're like, okay, well, mutual aid, just connecting on a human level is what's going to save us. Just knowing that mutual aid can be offered by anyone. You do not need a PhD, you do not need the stature, the class, all of these things, and really paying attention to the fact that a human person that acknowledges emotions, feelings, and all the things that come with it are the ways in which interaction can continue to build in a way that makes sense and includes all. And as mentioned before, mistakes will be made. And that's why colleagues and comrades are present and available to, assume good intentions, but treat and speak to impact. Thank you. I do have to run. Thank you so much to all. Thank you, New York Women's Foundation, Ford Foundation, and all of my panelists, colleagues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to the Ford Foundation for having us here and welcoming us, for all the folks that joined on Zoom. And for folks who want to read the report, please go to the New York Women's Foundation website under Learning, and you'll see that within our disability justice resources. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful day, and please take this conversation into the spaces that you'd go this afternoon.